The galaxy had never seen anything like it. An alien fleet, technologically advanced beyond anything humanity had ever imagined, had descended on Earth with a singular purpose: to crush the planet's defiance and make an example of it. For days, humanity watched in helpless terror as the invaders made their relentless march across Earth's orbit. The cities trembled, and the skies were filled with the ominous hum of ships that could wipe out entire continents with a single thought. But then, just as all seemed lost, there came a twist. A single, unexpected human victory. In the face of overwhelming force, a single battle, led by a military strategist with nothing but his mind and his unorthodox tactics, had turned the tide. It wasn't a miracle. It was something else entirely. A genius, one that had been cultivated in the shadows of obscurity, had emerged to challenge everything the galaxy knew about human capabilities. The universe had underestimated Earth, and now it would learn that humanity wasn't just fighting to survive, it was fighting to rise. The strategist was Captain Riker Wren. Before the war, he had been a quiet, almost invisible figure in the military. Not the kind of person who caught the public's eye, nor one who made waves in high command. He had risen not through political connections or military accolades, but through sheer intellect. An academic by nature, he had studied the art of warfare from history's greatest tacticians and then turned their lessons into something unique, something the alien invaders had never seen. The first time he put his strategy into play, it had worked. And it worked so well that even the invaders had to stop and reconsider their approach. Riker wasn't just an underdog. He was the embodiment of humanity's most primal desire to overcome the impossible. His victory was not just a tactical win, it was a symbol, a declaration to the galaxy that Earth and its people would never be subjugated, that the human spirit, often underestimated, was capable of things far beyond the grasp of any alien empire. As the first wave of shock and awe settled, the weight of that victory began to sink in. But the war was far from over, and the true test of Riker's genius had only just begun. The first wave hit at dawn. The sky, once a soft blue canvas, was now torn apart by the sleek, intimidating silhouettes of alien ships, each one a harbinger of death. They were here. The Zalthor, a technologically superior race that had ravaged countless worlds before Earth, had set their sights on humanity. Their ships were capable of harnessing gravitational forces, ripping apart entire continents, and their weapons made human defense systems look laughable. Within hours, the cities of Earth had turned to smoldering ruins, the sky thick with smoke and ash. It was supposed to be over quickly. The Zalthor had done their homework, studied human weaknesses, and executed their invasion with surgical precision. But in their calculations, they had failed to account for one thing: the unpredictable nature of humanity. For centuries, humans had been considered primitive by the galaxy's standards, even by their most closely related species. They were seen as a nuisance, something to be swept aside in the quest for galactic domination. But as Riker Wren, the unassuming strategist who had been drafted into the war, would come to demonstrate, humans didn't fight the same way as other species. As the Zalthor's ships tore through Earth's orbit, decimating the first wave of planetary defense, Riker sat alone in the war room, a place where very few soldiers ever ventured, much less a lowly captain with little combat experience. The room was dim, illuminated only by the flickering lights of communication panels, the hum of computer systems struggling to keep pace with the constant stream of incoming data. Riker's fingers tapped against the surface of a map, eyes scanning the trajectory of enemy ships that were already beginning to break apart Earth's defenses. Outside the windows, the world burned. "Sir, our cities have fallen. The capital is a lost cause. They're approaching the second line of defense," one of the officers said, breaking the silence. She was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she clutched a report. "We have to do something." "Anything," Riker replied, his voice cold, calculated, but filled with the weight of what was at stake. He wasn't one to lose his composure easily, but this situation tested even his unflappable demeanor. A part of him couldn't help but feel that the world was slipping through his fingers. The room fell into an oppressive silence. What was left to be said? The alien coalition was relentless and methodical in its conquest, but Riker wasn't just any military officer. His mind worked in ways that others couldn't quite grasp. His strengths weren't in direct combat, but in the art of strategy and manipulation. He had studied the great military minds of history, the likes of Sun Tzu, Napoleon, and Patton, and he had seen a pattern. The Zalthor were powerful, but they were also arrogant. They believed they had already won. That was their fatal mistake. "Prepare. The team," Riker said after a long pause. "We're not going to fight them head-on. We're going to make them question everything." The plan was risky. Hell, it was borderline insane. But what choice did they have? In the face of overwhelming force, Riker knew there was only one path forward. He would strike where the Zalthor were weakest, their blind spot. He had studied their communication systems, their command structures. Their reliance on technology was their greatest strength, but also their greatest vulnerability. And that vulnerability would be exploited. "We'll hack into their command ships and create a ghost network." Riker briefed his ragtag team of specialists. "Once we infiltrate their system, we'll plant false orders, cause confusion, disrupt their chain of command. If we can't defeat them with sheer strength, we'll defeat them with chaos." The officers and civilians in the room exchanged skeptical looks. They were soldiers, not hackers, not spies. But Riker's conviction was unshakable. There was a fire in his eyes, something primal, something human, and in that moment it was the only thing that gave them hope. "We're going to need a small window of opportunity," Riker continued. "If we can get in, even for just an hour, we can turn the tide. But if we fail, it's over. We're going to give them a war they never expected." The hours that followed were a blur of frantic planning, nerves, and uncertainty. As Earth's last remaining military assets gathered, Riker's team, composed of elite cyber specialists, former spies, and rogue military officers, prepared for what could very well be a one-way mission. They were operating without backup, their only hope lying in the success of their strategy. By the time they deployed, the Zalthor fleet had already decimated the Eastern Hemisphere. Their ships hovered above major cities, their energy shields so thick they could absorb anything humans threw at them. Riker's team infiltrated the command center, working with precision and speed. He watched as they breached the system, their fingers flying across keyboards, the tension mounting with every passing second. And then everything changed. The first signs of success were small but significant. Alien commanders, expecting to receive orders for further strikes, instead found themselves receiving conflicting directives. A simple act of misdirection had begun to unravel the carefully constructed web of Zalthor command. Their systems became riddled with contradictions, their tactics now chaotic. The Zalthor fleet, once a seamless, disciplined force, was now acting erratically. Ships started veering off course, hesitant, confused. The Zalthor were, for the first time, reacting to their environment rather than controlling it. Riker stood in the center of the war room, watching the chaos unfold on the screens. He could see the cracks beginning to form in their resolve. The Zalthor weren't prepared for a fight like this. Humans weren't supposed to be able to do this. For a moment there was silence. Then came the crackling voice from one of the senior commanders. "Sir, they've reacted. They've pulled back their main forces. They're retreating." A ripple of disbelief ran through the room. It was working. Their plan, against all odds, was working. Riker allowed himself the faintest smile, but it was fleeting. This victory, this small glimmer of hope, was only the beginning. The Zalthor had tasted defeat, but they weren't the kind to give up easily. They would retaliate, and they would come back stronger. But for the first time, humanity had shown them that it wasn't just a helpless species to be crushed. It was a force to be reckoned with. And Riker Wren had just made them realize that. As the dust settled, Riker turned to his team, his voice low but resolute. "This is only the beginning. We've got their attention now. Let's make sure they don't forget who we are." The war had shifted, but the real battle was only just starting. The aftermath of their first victory had been brief. In the days that followed, Riker had expected, no, he had known, that the Zalthor would strike back. They had underestimated humanity once, but they would not make that mistake again. The first retaliatory strike came with the ferocity of a predator that had just tasted blood. The Zalthor were not just technologically superior, they were relentless, and their patience was unmatched. Riker's initial victory had shaken them, but it also prompted them to adapt. No longer were they simply launching attacks from the safety of their ships. No, this time, the Zalthor took a more hands-on approach. They began to strike with precision. Their fleet split, deploying forces on the ground, targeting human strongholds directly. They sent assault troops, armored war machines that tore through cities with terrifying efficiency. Every resistance outpost, every small human victory, was met with brutal retaliation. Riker sat at the heart of the war room once again, the stark glow of the monitors casting an eerie light on his face. The weight of his previous success pressed down on him like an invisible hand. Success had come at a cost, and now the Zalthor were coming with a vengeance. "We need to act quickly, Riker," Commander Harlow said, her voice tight with urgency. "If they hit the Western Front, we'll lose the last of our supply lines. Our forces are stretched thin." Riker studied the data before him, his mind racing. The Zalthor weren't just attacking, they were exploiting every weakness they could find. Their forces had split into smaller units, launching guerrilla-style raids on Earth's defenses. They were wearing down humanity bit by bit, targeting strategic locations to cripple supply chains and morale. It was a tactic he had anticipated, but its speed and precision still caught him off guard. "Prepare the counter-offensive," Riker said, his voice cold and deliberate. "We'll hit them where it hurts most, their supply lines. If we can cripple their reinforcements, we might have a shot at turning the tide." He turned to his team, a mix of soldiers and analysts. They had all been part of the first successful strike, and they knew just how high the stakes were. But even now, Riker could see the uncertainty in their eyes. The last victory had been born out of desperation. This time, they were walking straight into the Zalthor's crosshairs. As the counteroffensive began, the pace of the battle escalated rapidly. Riker's plan was daring: divide the Zalthor forces further, causing confusion in their command and control. The strategy was based on deception. They would launch false signals, tricking the enemy into believing there were more human strongholds than there actually were. It was a desperate attempt to force the Zalthor to waste precious time and resources, but Riker knew that it would only work if his forces acted with precision. He couldn't afford another mistake. Days passed in a blur of tactical maneuvers and firefights, but each time Riker thought they had gained an advantage, the Zalthor adapted. They were becoming more unpredictable, more dangerous, and with each new move, Riker felt the weight of his decisions bearing down on him. His mind, once sharp and certain, was now clouded by doubt. He wasn't sure if it was the pressure of the war or the strain of having to lead so many lives, but Riker began questioning the morality of his own tactics. The deeper they went into the war, the more he began to wonder, was this still a fight for survival, or had it become something darker? Was he losing sight of who he was fighting for? It wasn't just the strategies that were wearing him thin. The personal cost was becoming clearer every day. Lives were being lost, but not just enemy lives. People Riker had come to trust and care for had fallen. He couldn't look at the faces of his fellow soldiers without seeing their fear reflected in his own eyes. But it was the civilians, the innocent bystanders who were paying the ultimate price that kept him awake at night. "Riker, we've intercepted." "Communication," a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Lieutenant Dorian, one of his most trusted officers. "There are factions within the Zalthor, disgruntled commanders, defectors from the coalition. They're reaching out for peace, for an alliance." Riker's head snapped up. Peace with the Zalthor? The idea was ludicrous, but in the chaos of war, strange alliances were born, and desperation often led to unexpected outcomes. "How do you know they're not playing us?" Riker asked, his tone skeptical but intrigued. "They're offering intelligence. We've verified some of it. They've given us positions of key military installations," Dorian said, his eyes narrowing. "It could be a trap, but it's a chance we can't ignore." Riker considered this. They were fighting a technologically superior enemy. The Zalthor had the resources, the manpower, and the firepower. But this was an opportunity, a chance, to exploit the cracks in their armor. If he could form an alliance with these defectors, they could gain valuable intelligence and weaken the Zalthor from within. "Get me a secure line to these defectors," Riker said. "We'll listen, but we move fast. If this is a trap, we'll be ready." In the days that followed, Riker found himself facing a new dilemma. The alliance was not what he expected. The defectors, while useful, were reluctant partners at best. Their motivations were unclear, and their loyalties were split. But they offered something critical: information. They gave Riker details about the Zalthor's hidden weapons caches, their fleet movements, and even weaknesses in their defensive lines. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. But the cost of war was never as simple as strategy. The internal strain began to show. During one critical mission, Riker's forces targeted an enemy supply depot, a location based on the information the defectors had provided. But something went horribly wrong, a miscalculation, an overzealous strike team. It resulted in an attack that had not only taken down the depot, but also caused collateral damage to a nearby civilian settlement. The devastation was catastrophic. Entire families were wiped out in the blast. The faces of those who had died haunted Riker's every thought. "How many?" Riker asked, his voice hollow as he stood before the burned-out husk of the settlement. "Too many," Dorian replied quietly. "At least 200 civilians were caught in the blast." Riker felt his chest tighten, a pang of guilt slicing through him. This was no longer about military strategy. It was no longer about victory or defeat. It was about something more primal, more human. He had promised to protect the people of Earth, but in his drive to fight the enemy, he had become the instrument of their suffering. "This can't happen again," Riker muttered to himself, his hands clenched into fists. The cost of the war had crossed a line. The line between justifiable action and the horrors of conflict had blurred. But there was no turning back now. War was escalating, and Riker's role had become more than just that of a strategist. It had become that of a leader who would have to live with the consequences of every decision he made. He could no longer ignore the moral cost of warfare. Every victory had its price, and the price for this war was being paid in blood. "We keep moving," Riker said, though his voice wavered. "We fight, but we do it with honor. We protect what's left of this world." But as the days turned to weeks, Riker found himself questioning whether honor could survive in a war like this. The operation had been nothing short of daring. Riker knew that capturing a high-ranking officer from the Zalthor would give them the edge they needed, intelligence, the kind that could reshape the trajectory of the war. It was a calculated risk, and one that few had the courage to undertake. The Zalthor were infamous for their impenetrable defenses and ruthless efficiency. But Riker's team was different. They didn't fight like the others. They didn't rely on brute strength or overwhelming firepower. They relied on ingenuity, stealth, and precision. The mission began under the cover of darkness. Riker's team had infiltrated an enemy command center, hidden deep in the heart of a war-torn city that the Zalthor had already claimed as their own. It was a tactical nerve center, a place where the highest levels of command conducted operations, plotting the fall of entire human territories. It was inside these walls that the secrets of the Zalthor's war machine resided. As the team moved through the enemy's stronghold, tension radiated in the air. The silence was thick, broken only by the soft hum of their cloaking devices. It was a high-stakes operation. Failure meant death, not just for them, but for the millions they were fighting to protect. The team's objective was clear: capture the commander, extract as much intel as possible, and get out before the Zalthor could retaliate. Inside the control room, Riker's heart pounded in his chest as he saw the alien commander, cloaked in his armor, standing with his back to the team. The alien was a towering figure, with his sharp, inhuman features glowing faintly under the sterile lights of the command center. Riker didn't hesitate. His hand shot up, signaling his team to move in. The operation was swift. Precision strikes, disabling the guards, a seamless execution of their carefully crafted plan. The commander was secured, his struggles futile against the enhanced restraints that now bound him. Riker's heart raced, but his mind stayed sharp. This was it. This was the breakthrough they needed. The commander, still reeling from the shock of capture, was brought to a hidden interrogation room. As Riker stood before him, his team quietly monitored the interrogation process. The Zalthor was defiant. At first, prideful in his alien superiority, but slowly, with the right combination of pressure and skill, cracks began to form. It was in the moments between words that Riker saw something. A look of hesitation, a flicker of doubt in the commander's eyes. "We want to know everything," Riker said, his voice calm but forceful. "Every weakness, every plan, the strategy your people are building, and why you're so desperate to destroy us. Talk, and you'll live. We can help you." The commander sneered, his alien lips curling in disgust. "You believe you can understand the war you're in? You are nothing but insects waiting to be crushed beneath our heel. But the truth—" He paused, as if the very idea of revealing it pained him. "There is someone pulling the strings. The war, it is not about you or your world. It is about something far bigger than your human mind can comprehend." Riker leaned in, the urgency in his eyes growing. Who? Who is behind this? The commander's eyes flickered with a strange mix of fear and something else, an unspoken understanding that he had already crossed a line. "There is a shadow. It controls everything, even the Zalthor. Its influence reaches beyond your understanding. It has twisted us. It has twisted all of us." For the first time in the conversation, Riker felt a true sense of unease. What was the commander talking about? What shadow? His mind began to race, but before he could press further, the commander spat on the floor, his voice now a low growl. "You'll never survive what's coming. We were only the beginning." The interrogation continued, but nothing further of value came from the alien commander. Riker and his team had gotten their answers, but they had also gained more questions. Who was this shadow the commander spoke of, and what did it mean for the war they had so fiercely fought? Later that evening, Riker gathered his closest advisors in the command center. Dorian, Harlow, and a few trusted officers sat around the table, faces tense as they processed the information. "The commander said we were only the beginning," Dorian said, his voice betraying his concern. "What did he mean by that? It doesn't make sense. We're winning these battles. We have the advantage." Riker ran his hands through his hair, trying to process the implications. "This doesn't feel like a war. Not anymore. Something's off. The way they're attacking, the sudden shifts in strategy, It doesn't feel like the Zalthor anymore. There's someone else behind this, someone manipulating everything. A chilling silence filled the room. No one spoke for a long moment, the weight of the commander's words hanging heavy in the air. "It makes sense," Harlow finally spoke, her voice steady but troubled. "All their movements, they've been too calculated, too coordinated. It's as if someone's pulling the strings from behind the scenes." Riker's eyes hardened. "We need to find out who this shadow is and what they want. If this is some kind of larger game, we need to understand the rules." But before they could begin formulating their next move, betrayal struck from within. It came from an unlikely source. Captain Ilara, one of Riker's most trusted officers. She had been with him through thick and thin, a loyal ally in the war. But now she was standing across the room, her eyes cold, her posture stiff. "Riker, I've made my decision," Ilara said, her voice thick with a mix of regret and resolve. "I can't follow you anymore. You've gone too far." Riker's heart sank, disbelief washing over him. "What are you talking about?" Ilara didn't flinch. "You're becoming too much like them. You've lost your way. The tactics, the manipulation. I can't stand by while you sacrifice everyone. We've fought to protect." "You're wrong," Riker spat, his voice rising. "I'm fighting for the future of humanity. Every choice I make is to protect our people. But at what cost?" Ilara's eyes were filled with sorrow, but there was an unmistakable determination in them. "You're becoming a tool. You've become someone I can't follow." Without another word, Ilara turned and walked out of the room. The door closed behind her with a finality that felt like a slap in the face. The tension in the room was suffocating. Betrayal was a bitter poison, and it had seeped into the heart of Riker's inner circle. He couldn't believe it. How could Ilara, someone who had fought alongside him, someone he trusted, turn her back on everything they had built? But there was no time for self-pity. There was a war to fight, and a shadow to uncover. But as the hours passed, a new, even darker revelation came to light. The information Riker had uncovered from the alien commander was even more disturbing than he had anticipated. The Zalthor weren't the only threat in this galaxy. There was something far more dangerous, a weapon of unimaginable power being developed by the very shadow the commander had spoken of. Riker stood in front of his team, staring at the data on the holographic screen before him. His voice dropped to a whisper. "This is it. This is what they've been preparing for. A weapon that could change everything. It's not just the Zalthor we need to worry about anymore. There's something worse coming. Something that could wipe out entire star systems. We need to act. Now, before it's too late." The room fell into a stunned silence. Riker's eyes burned with determination, but inside, a storm raged. The stakes had never been higher. He had won battles, he had fought for humanity, but this was bigger than anything he could have ever imagined. The war was no longer just about survival. It was about something far more dangerous, the future of the entire galaxy. The campfire crackled softly, its warm glow flickering against the dense darkness that surrounded the small, secluded clearing. Riker sat on a makeshift log bench, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes staring into the flames as they danced in hypnotic patterns. The night was unnervingly quiet. The sounds of battle, of chaos were miles away now, but they lingered in his mind, relentless, unyielding. It had been weeks since they had captured the high-ranking commander, weeks since the mission had shifted, from a fight for survival to something much bigger, something far more dangerous, and yet here he was, alone. The team was on high alert, ready for their next move, but Riker couldn't bring himself to go back into the fray, not yet. He needed this moment. His gaze never wavered from the fire, though his thoughts were far from it. The war was taking its toll, not just on the planet, but on him. His body had grown accustomed to the sleepless nights, the constant tension in his muscles. The stress of leading humanity's last stand had settled into his bones like a constant ache. But it wasn't just the physical exhaustion that weighed him down. It was the emotional toll, the sacrifices, the choices he had made, each one a step further. From the man he had once been, he ran a hand through his unkempt hair, pushing it back with frustration. The victories felt hollow now. What had started as a fight to protect his world, to defend his people, had morphed into something far more complex, more alien to him. He had become a strategist, a symbol of hope, but he had lost something along the way. Something he wasn't sure he could ever regain. Riker had never imagined himself as a leader. He had been a student of war, a tactician, yes, but a man of quiet thought and calculated plans. He had never sought glory or recognition, but the demands of the war had forced him into a position he never wanted. And now, it wasn't just about defeating the enemy, it was about keeping his people alive, and sometimes that meant making decisions that felt like they were tearing him apart inside. He thought back to the betrayal. Ilara, the woman he had trusted, the one who had stood by him through thick and thin. She had walked away, her words still echoing in his mind. "You've become someone I can't follow." It stung more than he cared to admit, and it gnawed at him in his quiet moments. Had he really changed that much? Was he losing himself to the war, to the cause? The stars above twinkled coldly in the night sky, indifferent to the turmoil inside. Him, he had always found solace in the vastness of space, in the way the universe seemed so much larger than his own problems. But now, even the stars felt distant, unreachable. The weight of responsibility had pushed everything else aside. His friends, his family, his own sense of self. Riker closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath, trying to center himself. What had he really lost? The war had taken so much from him, so many lives, so many choices that had haunted him, each decision feeling like it was pushing him further down a path he couldn't come back from. He had always been taught that sacrifice was a part of war, that it was necessary, but the cost was becoming too much to bear. He thought of the civilians who had died in the crossfire of his operations, of the families torn apart by his decisions. The collateral damage was inevitable in war, but it didn't make it easier to live with. Every face of the fallen had started to blur into one indistinguishable mass, a weight pressing on his conscience, reminding him that each life lost wasn't just a statistic, it was a person. A mother, a father, a child. And then there was the moment with the alien commander, the confession about the shadow pulling the strings. The war had always seemed so straightforward, so simple, a fight for survival. But now, Riker realized that it wasn't just about defending Earth anymore. It was about something much larger than any one battle. Something that threatened the very fabric of the galaxy itself. The realization gnawed at him, leaving him feeling both powerless and determined. What had he been fighting for? Was Earth just one pawn in a much larger, more intricate game? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft crunch of footsteps in the dirt behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Dorian, the man who had stood by him through every mission, every strategy, every sleepless night. "You're still out here," Dorian said quietly, settling beside Riker, his voice betraying none of the weariness that Riker could feel in his bones. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Dorian had been with him from the beginning, a stalwart presence in the chaos, but even he had started to show the signs of the war's toll. They all had. "I can't go back," Riker said, his voice raw, betraying more vulnerability than he intended. "Not yet. I need a moment." Dorian nodded. "You've earned more than a moment, Riker. But you'll need to face it eventually. This war, it's not something we can run from." I don't know who I am anymore, Riker muttered, his eyes dark. Every decision, every battle, it's changing me. It's changing all of us. I don't even recognize the man I see in the mirror. Dorian sighed, his voice steady but filled with a knowing sympathy. You've always been a leader, Riker. But even leaders need to take a breath, step back. We're all in this together. We all have our doubts, our fears. You're not alone in this. Riker looked at him, his eyes tired but searching. And the people who trust me? What about them? They trust you because you've shown them what it means to fight, to stand up when it seems like the world is falling apart. You don't need to be perfect, Riker. You just need to be there when it counts. Riker didn't know how to respond to that. What Dorian said made sense. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to have all the answers. Maybe it was okay to be flawed, to doubt himself. But there was one thing that Riker knew for certain. He couldn't stop fighting for Earth, for his people, for the chance to make things right. You're right, Riker said quietly, more to himself than to Dorian. But this war, this shadow manipulating everything, it's bigger than anything we've faced before. I need to be ready. You will be, Dorian replied with quiet conviction. We all will be. They sat there in silence for a while longer, the weight of the war pressing down on them. But as the fire crackled and the cool night air began to settle, Riker felt something shift inside him. The road ahead was uncertain, and the battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they could win this war. Maybe they could uncover the truth behind the shadow. But one thing was clear. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, and for the first time in weeks, Riker allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could still find a way to save everything they had fought for. The final assault had begun. Riker stood at the head of the command table, the map of the enemy stronghold sprawling before him. It was a complex web of defenses, a fortress that had been built to withstand the most intense sieges. But this time, it would be different. This time, the Zalthor would not be ready for what was coming. They thought they knew humanity, thought they had already predicted every move. But they were about to learn how wrong they were. The plan was bold, a multi-front assault that would strike the Zalthor on every possible level. Riker's forces would hit the stronghold from 3 separate angles, each one coordinated to perfection. It would be a blitz, a storm of human ingenuity and desperation. The Zalthor had believed their technology and their might were unbeatable, but Riker's forces had something more powerful, unity and a tactical genius that had already turned the tide once before. The air was thick with anticipation as Riker addressed his troops one last time before the operation commenced. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had fought for. "We've come a long way, and now it's time to finish what we started. We're not just fighting for Earth anymore. We're fighting for the future of the galaxy. Every life, every sacrifice, every battle, it all leads to this moment, and we're going to make it count. Together." His words reverberated through the soldiers gathered before him, their faces etched with determination and fear. They knew what was at stake. They knew the price of failure. But they also knew that Riker was right. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the one chance to push back the darkness that had threatened to consume them all. The assault began with a deafening roar as Riker's forces launched their attack. The first wave hit with precision, disabling the Zalthor's outer defenses and creating a breach in their fortified perimeter. The second wave followed closely, behind, cutting off their escape routes and securing key points within the stronghold. It was a synchronized, well-oiled machine, each unit moving with deadly efficiency. For the first time in the war, the Zalthor were scrambling, reacting, rather than controlling, and that was where Riker's forces had the upper hand. But as the battle raged on, the cost became painfully clear. The Zalthor were fierce, and they weren't about to go down without a fight. Their retaliation was swift and brutal, and the human forces were pushed to the brink. The odds were against them, and for a moment Riker felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. The familiar fear, the knowledge that in war, victory was never guaranteed. That's when it happened. Captain Dorian, Riker's most trusted ally and friend, stepped forward to lead a key flank in the final assault. He was the heart of the operation, the one who had kept the forces grounded in the chaos, the one who had helped Riker craft the perfect plan. But as the battle reached its peak, Dorian found himself facing an enemy unlike any they had anticipated, a rogue faction of the Zalthor that had evolved beyond their own commanders. They were too powerful, too well coordinated. Dorian's team was caught in the crossfire, and as Riker watched from a distance, his worst fears were realized. Dorian, the one person who had always been there, always been the calm in the storm, was now in danger of being overwhelmed. Riker felt the familiar surge of desperation flood his veins as he watched Dorian hold the line, fighting with everything he had to protect his comrades. The intensity of the battle grew, and for a moment it seemed like they might lose everything. Riker's voice cut through the chaos, his orders sharp and decisive, directing the reinforcements to change tactics. But then, as if the universe had conspired against them, disaster struck. The enemy forces unleashed their deadliest weapon, a shockwave that tore through the battlefield, decimating everything in its path. In the explosion's wake, Riker's heart sank as he realized what had happened. Dorian was gone. The realization hit Riker like a punch to the gut. His friend, his brother in arms, the one person who had been with him from the very beginning, gone in an instant. Riker felt the world around him shatter, the weight of his grief threatening to pull him under. But even in that moment of crushing loss, he knew there was no time to mourn. The battle wasn't over, and Dorian would never want him to stop fighting now. With a renewed sense of purpose, Riker surged forward, leading the charge into the heart of the enemy stronghold. The remaining forces, galvanized by Dorian's sacrifice, followed suit. It was a brutal, unforgiving push, but with each step they drew closer to their goal. They could see the final objective, the weapon that had been created by the shadowy entity manipulating the Zalthor. It was a weapon unlike anything they had ever faced, a gargantuan construct capable of destroying entire star systems. But as Riker and his team reached the heart of the stronghold, they found themselves in a final, desperate race against time. They fought tooth and nail, each blow a testament to their will to survive, until finally the weapon was disabled. The destruction of the Zalthor's ultimate weapon was the final blow to their empire. They had won, but the victory was bittersweet. Riker stood in the ruins of the stronghold, the quiet aftermath of the battle settling in around him. His team had triumphed, but the cost had been immense. Dorian's sacrifice had tipped the balance, but it was a price that no one could truly repay. As the dust settled and the fires of battle began to fade, Riker felt the weight of the moment. They had done it. They had won. But the victory came at the cost of so much, so many lives lost, so many dreams shattered, and the road ahead was still uncertain. The galaxy was left in ruins, its future hanging in the balance. But the one thing that was clear to Riker was that they had made a stand, and they had won. The months that followed were a time of rebuilding. Riker found himself taking on a new role, one that he never could have imagined before. With the war over, the galaxy now needed leadership, guidance, and unity. The fractured factions that had once fought against each other were now bound by a common cause, the survival of their civilizations. Riker's focus shifted. He had fought for humanity's survival, but now he found himself working to ensure that future wars like this would never occur. He dedicated himself to diplomatic efforts, seeking peace between the once warring factions and ensuring that the lessons learned in the fire of war would never be forgotten. Yet, even as the galaxy began to heal, one thing lingered in Riker's mind: the shadow that had manipulated the Zalthor. The remnants of that influence were still present, a hidden force working behind the scenes. Though they had struck a blow against it, Riker couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The war had ended, but the battle for the galaxy's soul was far from over. As Riker stood looking out over the horizon, watching the stars flicker in the sky, he couldn't help but wonder what else was out there, and who or what was pulling the strings. The shadow was still out there, and one day they would have to face it.